Okay, so we're going to start on chapter 14 today, which is an introduction to how biological diversity actually comes about, so a process called speciation. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this chapter. I'm going to start off today telling you mostly a story about speciation events that are occurring in our lifetime right now. So a story about birds that have begun to speciate in the last 60 years. And then we will continue with class on Thursday and next week talking about some of the large-scale events that are going on in speciation, and then a little bit about taxonomy will really lead us into our next chapter, which actually begins to look at some specifics of different biological diversity. Before we move forward, though, and start on chapter 14, I want to review some of the major themes from chapter 13 so that we're on the same page when we enter this chapter. So we spent some time last class talking about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So HW equilibrium stands for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium was the equation that we talked about a little bit. It's p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, or p plus q equals 1. So both of those equations are part of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So this means that the proportion of homozygous dominant plus the proportion of heterozygous plus the proportion of homozygous recessive would equal your whole population. And we talked about populations that have different ratios, maybe p equals 0.8 and then q would equal 0.2. This ratio between the two different alleles is not expected to change from generation to next as long as the different rules that govern Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium are met, and there are a number of different rules. So change will not occur from generation to the next, which means Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium will be satisfied if a population is very large, which means it will not be subject to genetic drift. We talked in last class about how small populations tend to randomly fluctuate and by chance could end up fixing one or another of the different alleles. Population must also be isolated from other populations, so therefore no gene flow. And we talked about how gene flow between different populations can lead to the two populations looking more similar, and it reduces differences rather than increasing them and causes more stable populations over long periods of time. And also there must not be any selective pressures. So selective pressures could be things like non-random mating. So we'll talk about a case of mate choice today, which has led to speciation in certain groups of organisms. There also must be no natural selection, so no selective pressures, so nothing driving one phenotype to be more successful than another phenotype, so no differences in fitness of individuals. And also there has to be no net mutations, which means that there can't be anything that alters alleles, deletes, or duplicates genomes, which could modify the gene pool on a larger scale. So as long as all these are met, we expect there to be equilibrium, which means there would be no changes in gene frequencies over time. If any one of these is not met, if any of them is violated, then there would be a change in gene frequencies over time, and we'd see differences in the ratios of one allele to another, and this would mean that evolution is occurring. And this could even be evolution on a very, very small scale, so microevolution, in which case you may not see large changes in organisms, but there would be changes occurring at a small scale. Okay. If it's natural selection that's driving these, I just wanted to review again before we go forward different possible outcomes of natural selection. So here's a population of mice that varies in fur color. Remember that natural selection can only act on populations with some natural variation within them, so there has to be variation present, and then one variety or something would have to be selected for or selected against to lead to natural selection. So let's say there's a selection for one of the extremes, like the darker furred mice, This would be called directional selection, where the population makeup is shifted in favor of one of the extreme phenotypes. There's also, so this would be a case where you have pressure pushing it towards the darker phenotypes, in which case the lighter phenotypes might disappear in the population. Another way that natural selection can occur is something called disruptive selection, and we talked about this. This is forcing phenotypes to two extremes, and this we'll actually see today could be a mechanism for speciations. You're driving towards the lightest and the darkest fur, driving away from the intermediate individuals. And a third different way that natural selection can drive populations is called stabilizing selection, and this is where extreme phenotypes are actually selected against, and it reduces variations in the population and forces them more towards the middle. And we looked at the case of sickle cell anemia, which is a stabilizing selection. It stabilizes those heterozygotes where the two extremes, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, were selected against in areas where malaria was present. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is a process called speciation. So it's the origin of new species. So this is a process by which one species can be split into two or more species. And it's something that has led to a tremendous amount of diversity of life throughout our planet, explains the differences that we've seen between species, and also explains why there are still some similarities. So here's some pictures of varieties of birds. There are over 9,000 species of birds living in very diverse habitats, from birds that live on the ocean to birds that live in the tropics to birds that live in the Arctic, each with very unique features and yet also similarities to them. They all contain a lot of similar features, flight and feathers, things like that. And this all is due to how they came about and how they evolved. Just remember the stories I was telling you about Darwin's voyage to the Galapagos, where he saw, for instance, the birds on different islands, birds that are well adapted to cactus, living on an island with cactus, and birds that had beaks that were well adapted to eating insects, living on islands with insects. What we're going to be talking about today can explain why he saw things like that. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a new species that is found in Europe, or we're talking about a species of bird found in Europe that is actually in the process of forming two very distinct populations, and might be a case where speciation is actually occurring right before our eyes. So the species we're going to be looking at is a European blackcap, which is this bird here. It's a very small bird. It feeds on insects, but it's opportunistic. And what opportunistic means is that it would feed on anything that it might come into contact with. It's more of a scavenger, so it might feed on seeds if it was presented seeds. It might feed on insects if it found insects, but it would basically feed on anything that it came across that was edible. These are birds that have distinct plumages. The males were, like in the last picture, have a distinct black cap, and that's what they're named for. Females look more like this picture here. They have more of a brown cap on their head. And they are migratory species, which means they spend part of their life or part of the year in one part of the world, and they spend another part in another part of the world. So we're familiar in Florida with migratory species. A lot of them pass through here on their way south in the winter, and they pass through here again on their way north in the summer. And they do this in change of the seasons. So where the European blackcap is found in the spring and summer is in Germany and Austria. So this is where they actually breed. So they'll breed in the summers and springs in this part of Europe, in Germany and Austria. And in the winter, what they'll do is they'll migrate from Germany and Austria to Portugal and Spain, or even to North Africa. So they migrate south in the winter. They sometimes will migrate together as one large population, and they tend to overwinter in these more southern areas. So they don't follow the arrow. They don't follow the direct path from Germany to Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. Instead, there's a fair amount of variation in the paths that they take. Some of them will fly across France, which is similar to what's indicated here, but a lot of the birds will take a more roundabout route where they'll actually head west first, heading across northern France to Britain, and then they will continue south to the Mediterranean. Eventually, they all would end up traditionally in their wintering grounds down in Portugal, Spain, and North Africa. Okay. In the 1960s, birders in Britain began reporting that blackcaps would remain throughout the winter in Britain. And since then, numbers have soared. So there were only a few in the 1960s, but year after year, more and more blackcaps began spending their winters in Britain until now, where there's about 10% of the population of European blackcaps are found in Britain throughout the winter, whereas the 90% still migrate to Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. So this has happened over only about 30 generations of birds, so pretty big change very fast. So the question that researchers looking at these blackcaps have had is, why does a portion of the population now migrate to an entirely different part of Europe that is pretty far away from their traditional wintering ground? So it's 1,200 to 1,800 kilometers between Britain and Spain and Portugal. So there's a pretty big difference in the two areas that they go to. So there's several hypotheses that might have changed this behavior. There's the fact that it's just a shorter migration route, so it might be a much quicker route to take to go to Britain rather than to fly all the way south to the Mediterranean. There's also the fact that there's a lot of food. So from the 60s on, there's been more and more people that will put out bird feeders in their backyards in the winter. So there's actually a pretty steady supply of food that would allow birds to remain in the winter in an area that typically would not have food available. Perhaps it was a change in wind patterns. Global warming has led to global climate pattern changes, and it may just be that it was more difficult for them to fly south, and that some of them actually followed the wind patterns to the west to go to Britain, and they found it too difficult to fly the distance to Spain and Portugal. Or another hypothesis is that there was just a genetic defect, so some kind of mutation that caused the birds to lose their way, and now instead of flying south, they end up just flying north or flying west. So currently, the most accepted reason for what has driven the blackcap behavior is actually bird feeders in Britain. So recent evidence points to a human involvement as a driving force in change. More and more people have put bird feeders in their gardens over the winter, which provides a steady supply of food for them. And with pretty much an endless supply of food and a climate in Britain that is pretty mild, there's been a gradual warming trend where the winters are not incredibly harsh in parts of Britain. A lot of these birds have stopped their migration flight and simply just overwinter in Britain, which used to just be a stopover point on their way south. So, what effect has this had on the blackcaps? So, having these two populations in separate areas during the winter has led researchers to predict that changes in these migration patterns may lead to eventual evolution of the blackcap population into two separate species. So before we talk about the evidence and maybe what has happened to the blackcaps as they've been separated during their winter stopovers, I want to talk a little bit about how speciation occurs. So speciation can occur in two pretty broad generic ways. The first one is allopatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is when a population is separated into two groups by physical barriers, and then this allows for independent evolution or changes in the two separated populations, which eventually can lead to speciation. So it's speciation that occurs because populations have been separated by a physical barrier. So an example of this is two species of closely related squirrels, so antelope squirrels, which live on either side of the Grand Canyon. So these two species are descended from the same ancestral species that lived before the river slowly carved its way through the rocks and eventually divided the squirrels on either side of the canyon into two separate populations. Once they were separated by the canyon and they could no longer share genetic information, over time, differences evolved in the two groups so that if they were to come back, they would now be isolated reproductively. They would no longer be the same. So they've separated pretty dramatically, and you now have one species on one side of the canyon and a different species on the other side of the canyon. Okay, so allopatric speciation, again, is when populations are separated by a geographic barrier. So here's an example of two possible outcomes of geographic separation. So two populations could become separated, like on the top here, and if they did become what's called sympatric again, they merged again and were able to meet up again, if they hadn't changed dramatically in the time that they were separated, the populations might interbreed and there would have been no speciation. And often this is a matter of time. So how long do they spend separated? How long have mutations been allowed to accrue in the two different species? Have different selective pressures acted on the different species in the different locations, or the different populations in the different locations? And has this led to then reproductive isolation? So in the top diagram, there was no reproductive isolation when they came back together, and so there's no speciation that's occurred. Whereas in the bottom graphic, we see that after a geographic separation, there might have been a different pressure on the green group, in which case the green group and the orange group have diverged now. They now cannot interbreed when they come back together. They have reproductive isolation and speciation has occurred. So this is allopatric speciation. This is very common. It's probably something that you can understand pretty well, that if separation by geographic areas, there now can be different selective pressures. So if we go back to Darwin's finches, this could be an example of allopatric speciation. Two finch species land on different islands. Each of those islands has its own selective pressure. So one species lands on two islands. One island has food source that is mostly insects. The other has food source that is mostly cactus. So on the cactus island, the birds with the longer beaks tend to survive better and reproduce. And on the insect island, the birds with the shorter beaks tend to survive more often and reproduce. Therefore, you'll end up with a long beak population on the cactus island and a short beak population on the insect island. And it's possible that enough mutations, other kinds of mutations, would exist in these two populations to lead to reproductive isolation. So if we were to bring them back together, they might not be able to interbreed. So that's called allopatric speciation. There's a geographic barrier. So the opposite of this would be sympatric speciation. And this happens when a reproductive barrier that's other than physical forms between two groups within a species. So the message here is that you don't have to have a geographic separation. So it's really easy to see how allopatric speciation can lead to divergence in species, but there is a possibility for another type of separation that is not a geographic one to occur that allows gene flow to cease from two populations, and then with a buildup of mutations and maybe different selective pressures, you can lead to speciation. So how can this happen if organisms live together? Well, it's a pretty good question how something like this occurs. So here's an example of different species that have evolved in a sympatric way. So African cichlids are a really good example of this. So there are over 200 species of cichlids in Lake Victoria in East Africa. So Lake Victoria is a huge lake in Eastern Africa. And here's an example of two of them. So under normal light, this is what these two species look like. There's a kind of greenish yellow one on the top there, and then there's a bluish orange one on the bottom there. So they're very brightly colored. They have different coloration to them. And what's thought to have led to the formation of 200 species is actually female mate choice. So females will select male mates based on their coloration, based on a color pattern, and they will pretty consistently choose males of their own species to mate with. So over time, these have caused this great diversification in coloration, but it's been very consistent with it. So females that are born from blue-orange cichlids will only mate with blue-orange cichlids, and females that are born from green-yellow cichlids will only mate with green-yellow cichlids. But what's interesting is that this speciation event has occurred fairly recently because there is no actual barrier to reproduction if we can get rid of female mate choice. So what researchers have done is they've actually put these cichlids in a monochromatic orange light. And if you look at the two species under monochromatic orange light, they actually look fairly similar. You can't see the big coloration variation. And if you do that, then they will interbreed. So only if you cut out the visual cues will they interbreed. Then the females will no longer only select the males of their species, they will actually breed with other species as well. And this is actually causing a loss of species diversity in Lake Victoria due to pollution. So pollution is leading to lower light levels, it's leading to less ability to have female mate choice drive the speciation, and these species are kind of converging and they're starting to form these hybrids that are mixing together the gene pools. So it's causing a loss of species diversity in Lake Victoria. So if these European blackcap species is actually undergoing speciation event, would we consider this to be allopatric or sympatric? So you may think allopatric since they are flying to two different wintering grounds, one in Britain and one in Africa and Spain. But keep in mind, where do these species actually breed? Where do they reproduce? And that is actually in Germany and Austria. So they do return to the same location. Both of these groups return to the same location. So this would be considered sympatric speciation because the two populations still breed in the same location. So the only thing that's different is where they overwinter. So if they are undergoing speciation, and this is a sympatric speciation, what could actually allow sympatric speciation to happen? The hypothesis is that this migratory divide between them, the populations, has led to reproductive isolation that is associated with genetic and phenotypic diversity. Okay, so what is reproductive isolation after all? So when a biological factor, or such as a reproductive barrier, impedes members of two species from producing viable, fertile offspring, this is what's considered reproductive isolation. So it's some kind of barrier that impedes members of two species from producing fertile or viable, fertile offspring. And there are lots of different mechanisms, lots of different kinds of reproductive barriers. And your textbook goes into it really nicely. So we've talked about a few of these. We talked about female mate choice. This is a behavioral isolation pattern that leads to two species not even attempting to mate. Here is an example of a mule. So a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. And although horse and donkey can have offspring that can have a mule, the mule is actually sterile. So the mules cannot reproduce themselves. So there's no way for gene flow to ultimately occur between those two species. So we do consider horse and donkey to be separate species. So although they have offspring that live, they are not fertile offspring. So here's a list of different reproductive barriers. And really, I don't want you to spend your time learning about all the different specific reproductive barriers, although we will have some examples throughout the course. Basically, we're talking about two different major types of barriers. One is prezygotic, so that's prior to fertilization, and the other is postzygotic. Some examples of prezygotic barriers could be habitat isolation. So this is the example from lions and tigers. So lions and tigers, if you put them in captivity together, a female from one and a male from the other, they will be able to breed and they will be able to have offspring, so a liger can exist and their offspring will be fertile. However, lions and tigers are not found in the same parts of the world. And so their habitats do not overlap, and their normal habitats will not come into contact with each other. So based on that, they are isolated. Behavioral isolations like the African cichlids, because of female mate choice, they will not choose to mate with each other. So that's going to prevent mating attempts. And there could be things like temporal isolations, which maybe certain species are only fertile certain times of year, and they might, even though they could have viable offspring, they're never temporarily in the same location or never fertile at the same time, and therefore this prevents a mating attempt. So there's also prezygotic barriers prior to fertilization that are post-mating. Now, this could be mechanical isolation, so physically maybe they can't actually, even though they might attempt to mate, they can't actually physically mate due to maybe their structure, their size, and they're not able to physically attempt a reproduction, though they can attempt mating. Or there might be gametic isolations where the sperm and the egg actually are not compatible and they do not cause fertilization. So post-zygotic barriers are post-fertilization. So after sperm, so they do have a mating attempt, sperm actually does meet egg in these species, and they might have things like reduced hybrid viability. So they could have offspring, but their offspring don't survive. They could have reduced hybrid fertility. So this is the case of a mule where they do have offspring, their offspring survive and do live for long periods of time, but their offspring are infertile. Or there might be hybrid breakdown where hybrids will not survive for very long periods of time. They will degenerate over time, and they're also not able to have offspring. So prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers can lead to reproductive isolation between two species. So the idea for these two populations of blackcaps, which might be leading to reproductive isolation, is timing. So many birds that migrate have cues as to when they should leave their wintering grounds and head back to their summer grounds to start reproducing. And blackcaps are triggered by day length. And as day length changes, the blackcaps will begin their migration. And because of when the day length changes is different in Europe than it is further south, the British migrants will leave earlier than the Mediterranean migrants. And turns out that British migrants begin arriving at the breeding grounds a full 2 weeks before their Mediterranean migrants. Since they are returning to breed, as soon as they return, they're going to start establishing breeding territory and start looking for a mate. So it's going to be more likely for the British migrants to find mates with those that are migrating from the same location and not wait for the latecomers. And therefore, by the time the Mediterranean migrants arrive, they're going to be more likely to mate with other Mediterranean birds and not with the British birds that have been there for 2 weeks already establishing their mating rituals. And when researchers look at this, they've actually found that blackcaps who winter together are 2.5 times more likely to mate with their own group than they are to mate with individuals that migrated to a different location. So this is what's called positive assortative mating, which means that they are positively choosing mates of their own type or from their own population and not ending up with mates from the other population. Okay. So this is one of the first times this was demonstrated in nature, which is pretty cool thing. And this is something that could lead to speciation. So if they tend to only be breeding with their own population, this is a barrier to gene flow between the two groups. And the British blackcaps and the Mediterranean blackcaps are, if they see differences in selective pressures or something that will drive them to have differences genetically, this could lead to speciation in the two groups. So there's been a lot of research done to test to see if there has been reproductive isolation, if there has been any speciation, or at least microevolution occurring in these two populations. So in the different regions and the different countries that they migrate to, there is different concentrations of certain isotopes, so different kinds of atoms in the water. And researchers were able to look at the birds' tissues and determine from that where they'd spent their previous winter. So whether they'd spent it in Britain or whether they'd spent it in the Mediterranean. So a captured bird in Germany were first determined where they'd spent their winter, and then what they did is they looked at these birds for physical and genetic differences between the two groups. So physical differences, they measured things like the beak shape, the beak size, and they also measured the wing shape, and they looked at plumage, so coloration, things like that. And then they also did genetic tests. They looked at DNA sequences and and looked to see if there was differences between the groups. So here is a plot of the migratory distance of the different birds and wing shape. So Hoyinski index is a measure of the wing pointedness, and they found that this group A, B, and C all differed in their wing pointedness. So group A had the least pointed wings, B had kind of rounded wings, but a little bit more pointed than A, and C had very pointed wings, long pointed wings. And it turns out that B was the British blackcaps, C was the Mediterranean blackcaps, and group A were a non-migratory population. So there's birds that do not migrate in the winter. We haven't talked about them, but they do exist. So the pointedness of the wings was different depending on how far the birds migrated. So why do you think rounder, more maneuverable wings might be an advantage for birds that migrate into Britain, as opposed to long, more pointed wings? So the answer has to do with what they feed on, and these birds are found feeding in the winter on bird feeders, where are very packed environments where they have to maneuver very quickly, and so it helps to have shorter wings. And you think the longer, more pointed wings might help the Mediterranean blackcaps actually make it to their migratory grounds, to have longer flight and be able to survive that long flight to the south. So shorter, more maneuverable wings on the blackcaps that are feeding on bird feeders, and longer, more pointed wings for the ones that migrate south. They also saw phenotypic differences in beak shape. So differences in beak shape could be good for exploiting different food sources. We talked about this again with the Galapagos finches. So large beaks, for instance, might be good for crushing seeds, whereas narrow beaks might be good for grabbing insects. Turns out that the Mediterranean migrants have much broader, wider beaks, whereas the British migrants have much narrower and longer beaks. And again, this might be an adaptation that is better for getting seed and fat from feeders. So the more narrow, longer beak birds were better able to feed themselves over the winter, and thus they're more likely to survive in the British groups, whereas maybe having a broader beak helps them with feeding from nature, feeding on berries and seeds that they find on trees down in the Mediterranean. In addition, the plumage was different in the two groups. So Mediterranean migrants were more gray in color, whereas the British migrants actually turned out to be more brown. And these differences, though there might not be a distinct reason for this, these differences might actually reinforce positive assortative mating, because mates will be able to identify those members of their own group based on coloration, and this might lead to even more differences over the generations between the two as they become more and more reproductive isolation. So what kind of selection is this? Is this a directional selection within the species? Is this a stabilizing selection, or is this a disruptive selection? Well, since it's choosing two extremes, so rounder, short wings versus longer, pointed wings, narrow beaks versus wide beaks, it's actually choosing for two extremes So this would be called disruptive selection. So remember, disruptive selection favors individuals at both extremes of the phenotype and selects against those with intermediate phenotypes. So you're seeing two different beak shapes, two different wing shapes, two different colorations. Okay. So in addition to all the phenotypic differences, British migrants were genetically distinct from the rest of the population. So even though they breed in the same location, because there has been this assortative mating selection, their DNA is becoming more and more dissimilar from the rest of the population. So the British migrants' DNA is different than the Mediterranean DNA. This indicates that they are becoming reproductively isolated, and we are seeing small evolutionary changes between the two groups. So gene flow has been reduced, and they're becoming more isolated. So in conclusion, what we've seen is that in a very, very short time, so just since the 1960s, we've seen mechanisms for sympatric speciation have formed. British migrants could be the forerunners to a new species of blackcaps. So this brings up kind of an interesting question of, do you think we should be feeding these birds over the winter? And what do you think would happen to the British migrants if people stopped putting out food in the winter? Well, they would probably, as you might think, migrate to different locations. They would no longer be able to stay in Britain for the winter, and they might rejoin the other blackcaps in migrating south. This would lead to increased gene flow and decrease the speciation that is already occurring. So one researcher has said that it's positive news for us because it means not all of the changes that humans produce are necessarily bad. Typically, a lot of the environmental conditions that humans have changed, or the destruction of habitat that humans have done, has actually led to extinction of species rather than the creation of new species, which is what we're seeing in the European blackcaps. Okay, so I'm going to change paces a little bit, so hopefully you have a good idea of how speciation might occur in that one example of European blackcaps. We're going to spend a little bit of time taking a look at what we've learned so far from a slightly different perspective. Back in chapter 13, there was a section in your book on evolutionary trees and looking at cladistics a little bit. We're going to be spending a fair amount of time looking at evolutionary trees in the future, so I wanted to really introduce this now. We're going to talk more about it later on in this chapter, and we're definitely going to revisit this when we start looking at each of the different groups of organisms over the next few chapters. So this is a very, very simplified tree of life for animals, and the way these trees work, they're basically showing you when different species had a common ancestor. So if I was to draw a tree like this for our blackcaps, which are beginning to speciate, I would have the British blackcaps on one tip, and I'd have the Mediterraneans on another one, and they would join together, and the spot that they joined together, that would be a recent common ancestor prior to them separating, prior to them migrating to different locations. So this tree actually represents time, in that on the left here you have the past, and on the right you have the present. So everything that's lined up on the very right represents a currently existing species, so a species that exists today. And as you work your way to the left, you're looking at how these species have diverged from one another. So you read the tree from past to present, and each one of the branches represents a common ancestor. So back farthest left node is a common ancestor to all animals. The first split was between these aquatic animals like fish and seahorses, and between some land animals like kangaroo and elephant here. So if you look at the node that's indicated by the speciation arrow, this is the point in time where kangaroos diverge from other land animals like elephants and cheetahs here. So by how close together different things are on these trees, you can tell how recently they had a common ancestor. So a seahorse versus an elephant shared a common ancestor a long time ago, back where their two branches exist way back here near the common ancestor to all animals, whereas a kangaroo and an elephant shared a common ancestor where that speciation arrow is. And another thing we can do with evolutionary trees is we can place characters on them. So here is a tree built from an iguana, a duck-billed platypus, a kangaroo, and a beaver. Iguanas are reptiles, whereas duck-billed platypus, kangaroo, and beaver are all mammals. So oftentimes when you have an evolutionary tree, you'll put something called an outgroup in here that will allow you to root your tree, because you know that iguanas share less characteristics and have a more distant common ancestor to all of the mammals. So the first split is in the mammal group is between the duck-billed platypus and kangaroos and beavers. So kangaroos and beavers share more characteristics. They've had a more recent common ancestor than the duck-billed platypus. And one thing that groups all of these mammals together is the presence of hair and mammary glands. However, kangaroos and beavers share some characteristics with each other that the duck-billed platypus do not, and one of those is gestation. So duck-billed platypus actually will lay eggs, so they are a mammal that will lay eggs, whereas kangaroos and beavers both have live birth. Beavers differ from kangaroos in that beavers have a very long gestation period. So kangaroos will give live birth, but they give live birth to to offspring that are very undeveloped. They're very young, and they are born in a very short time span, which is why kangaroos have those pouches. So marsupials like kangaroos will hold on to their offspring in their pouch and allow them to develop longer in the pouch. So they are unlike beavers, who have a long gestation period, so when their offspring are born, they are more fully developed, very much like humans. So you can see that as these different groups diverged, each one that stays more closely related, that has a recent common ancestor, will share more and more characteristics with each other. And that's typically what happens. Okay, so we can zoom in on groups of these trees of animals and have a closer look at just mammals. And this is kind of what we looked at in the past one. If you zoom in on one branch of the tree of mammals, you will find one species, such as a cheetah. And if you zoom in on cheetahs, you will find different cheetah populations. So we can look at evolution from many different levels, from a level of all animals, in which case mammals are a type of animal. We also have cheetahs, which are a type of mammal. And then we have cheetah populations, which are a subgroup of populations. So all the things that we've been talking about in terms of evolution, remember, occur below the species level, occur at the population level. And this is the same thing as we were seeing in the blackcaps, is that two populations of blackcaps are in the process of diverging, of speciating. And this is what microevolution leads to. What we will eventually, especially at the end of this chapter, we'll go back and look at those higher categories and look at how we can group things together based on evolutionary histories and put them into larger groups that share common characteristics. So speciation is the evolutionary process of one species splitting into two or more species, and this starts with separation of populations, reproductive isolation, and differences forming between those two groups. Okay. So I just want to start at this point now introducing a concept called macroevolution. We've been really focusing on microevolution, which is changes in just gene frequencies due to things like lack of gene flow, due to genetic drift, or due to actually selective pressure, as we've looked at in some of the different examples I've been putting forward. But another way we can look at evolution is from a very large scale, and we'll be doing this kind of over the next few chapters. Instead of looking at minute differences between species, we're going to be looking at larger differences between large groups of animals and large trends over long periods of time that have led to large differences. So things that we'll look for have overarching impacts on the history of life. So stability, change, lineages arising, and large-scale extinctions. So macroevolution is looking at things above the species level for the most part. So, and we'll be looking at that in terms of large trends. So one of these large trends that that would be included with these are big things, big events like extinctions, like what has happened with the dinosaurs. So big trends of rise and fall of dinosaurs. So one thing that we saw is that when dinosaurs were around, reptiles were the dominant species on Earth. They were found everywhere. There were reptiles of many different shapes and sizes, many different forms. But after mass extinction of the group of dinosaurs, we saw a great bloom in mammal diversity. So we saw mammals kind of take over the world and really diversify greatly. So we're going to be talking a bit about how mass extinctions lead to these large radiations of species and large increases in species diversity. So one of the big trends in evolutionary biology are mass extinctions, and mass extinctions can lead to this large availability of resources and rapid speciation. So we actually see this many, many times, and we'll come back to this, where a mass extinction event will be followed by a large number of speciation events and large increase in diversity in some groups. But it leads to big shifts, like the shift from reptiles to mammals. So just to remind you of how we know a lot of what we know, we know a lot of the information we do about Earth's history through the study of fossils, or through paleontology. But as important as the fossil record is, it's really important to keep in mind that it's not always the most perfect chronicle of evolutionary changes. Many species lack hard structures, so they don't have exoskeletons, they don't have structures that will survive for long periods of time to be fossilized, and even if they do, they have to die in the right place. So we've talked about these sedimentary rock formations allowing for us to see different species throughout evolutionary time, but we only see organisms that died in those sedimentary areas. Organisms that died elsewhere might not be preserved for fossilization. So one of the big questions that we have about evolution is, what is the pace of evolution? Does evolution occur gradually, like in the graph on the left, or does it occur in spits and bursts? So does it happen very rapidly over very short periods of time? So we can't go back in time to see these things. So this is a very difficult question to ask, but we can try to figure out what patterns we expect to observe in the fossil record if evolution does happen in bursts, or if it happened gradually, and then we can see if these predictions match up with what we observe. So if evolution was to occur slow and steady over a very long period of time, we'd expect to see an entire transition from ancestor to descendant displayed as these different transitional forms. And this is commonly what we refer to as the maybe missing link, looking for these transitional forms in the fossil record. But keep in mind, this is a very difficult question to ask of the fossil record. So, in fact, we have seen examples of transitional forms in the fossil record. So here we see a few steps in the evolution of whales from land-dwelling mammals. So whales, unlike other types of swimming organisms, swimming mammals are what we think has happened to them is that they were descended from land individuals that have returned to the sea. So land-dwelling mammals started living more and more in the ocean, and those that were better adapted to swimming and to spending long periods of time in the ocean were more likely to survive, and gradually they evolved into what we now know as today's whales. And here we actually do have preserved fossils from several different stages of the evolution of the whale, from individuals that looked more like land-dwelling mammals to individuals that looked like somewhere between a land mammal and a whale to current whales. So these do exist, and this does support a gradual transition from land dwelling to ocean swimming in whales. So there are two contrasting patterns that we'd expect to see in pace of evolution. Either we can have a gradual pattern like the whales, in which speciation events occur by steadily accumulation of many, many small changes, or there's something called punctuated equilibrium, in which case there would be long periods of very little change interrupted by or punctuated by relatively brief periods of very, very rapid change. So here's what they might look like graphically. So a gradual pattern, you're going to see gradual changes over time, whereas punctuated patterns, you're going to see many species of the same for very long periods of time, and then a very rapid change to a new species. However, this can be very difficult to tell by the fossil record. So what we might see in the fossil record might look like a big jump, might look like we've gone very quickly from one species to another, but this can be very hard to tell because it's possible, and it's also very likely, that transitional forms could be lost over time. So we may see the ancient form, we may see the red form, we may see the yellow form, but we may be missing this peach transitional stages, which makes it look more like punctuated equilibrium and less like a gradual change. So it can be very difficult to conclude that evolution has happened rapidly because it's very hard to prove that we are not missing something. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the lecture here for today, and we'll pick up at this point on Thursday, and we'll continue talking about some large trends in evolution and what kind of things might have led to some of these large evolutionary changes over long periods of time. We'll look at what might have led to the rapid diversification in mammals, and then we'll begin to talk probably next Tuesday about classification and how evolutionary patterns have been used to develop to inform our classification systems and allow us to name species. And this will really lead us into our talk about some more specifics on things like the biodiversity of bacteria, of algae, of land plants, of fungi, and of animals, which we will get to over the next few chapters. Okay, so that's it for today.